special, but it's really for everybody. So we are going to talk about Father Abraham. That's from our scripture, and there is so much to learn from him that we're even going to get to participate in a really great song. But I have these Bible fells so that we can talk about Abraham, and they look like him. So he had such great faith in the Lord and trust and obedience, so we can learn so much. But wouldn't it be really cool if we could learn from him in person and see what that would look like?
Everybody stand up. Let's do this song together. So are you. Very nice. Not bad. Not bad. So, before I get too far into my prepared remarks, I just want to say it's great to be here with all of you today. It was a long journey in, but it is wonderful to be here with you. And I also, sorry, I'm not used to this long hair actually. I want to apologize in advance for the cheesy song that will be stuck in your head for the rest of the week. You know that Father Abraham, I'm one of them. You know, it's going to be with you all week, and I apologize for you. And truth be told, the version that you learned in Sunday school is one that kind of drives me crazy, because my relationship with God and my relationship with humanity is so important that it's hard to boil down into this cheesy song that we learned in Sunday school. You know, this whole beard thing is really hard, especially in the summer. But God has used me, Abraham, Father Abraham, to put all of humanity onto a whole new trajectory. So couldn't we get U2 or Bono or Bruno Mars or Imagine Dragons or somebody like that to create this song? All right, well, enough of that. I want to just say thanks to Reverend Dempsey for allowing me to be here with you today. We ran into each other on the campus of the University of Dubuque, where I am working as an associate professor of Old Testament studies, and he was on campus for his work on his D-Min. And he was talking about how they were going to be working through Romans and using different learning styles, and so we thought it would be good to have a different preacher in here this morning. And I have not seen him this morning. I think he's down at the Colorado Rockies game getting one of those bobbleheads. So keep an eye out for him, but I am extremely thankful for this opportunity. I also want to let you know that Sarah will not be with us today either, but she wishes she could be here. So, since I am here with you, I'm assuming that you are working your way through the 4th chapter of the Romans, the letter that Paul wrote to that church in Rome. Paul, in this letter, does such a fantastic job in naming the issues that even I was dealing with so many centuries before. The same issues that were driving my family crazy were the same issues that he was preaching about and he was dealing with in Rome. Both Paul and I are on the same page. We want people to know that God offers a different way of dealing with brokenness, a different way of reconciling, and that God is at work in our lives. And it's through justification. It is through what God is working through and not what we do. But I want to tell you a little bit more about myself before we get into idolatry and reconciliation. As I said before, I am happily married. I'm married to Sarah. We have many sons. Oh, sorry, I couldn't resist that. And many grandchildren, and far too many grandchildren to mention by name this morning. Now, one of the things that I love about my wife is that Sarah has a great sense of humor. I mean, she did laugh at God when God told her that she would be pregnant in her 90s. And yet, she is the most powerful woman of all of creation. She is the one who all women bow down to. She is the one who, like the likes of Cleopatra and Catherine the Great and Margaret Thatcher and Hillary Clinton, they get their power from her. She was the founder. She's the mother of humanity. In a sense, God has made me and Sarah the parents of us all. And it is truly an honor to have that role. But it's not just an honor. It's an important theological point because it demonstrates that God reckons all people as righteous. Not just those who happen to have a claim on the family line of tree. Instead, Paul makes the point, and I make the point, that all of us are reconciled before God. All of us are made whole. You see, I was blessed before my circumcision. I was blessed, and I was given an assignment, and I talked to God before I officially became a Jew. And in God's promise, I became the father of the nations. Not because I did everything perfectly, but instead simply because I'm Abraham. That night, so long ago, when we looked up into the stars and I could see all those millions of stars, I thought, wow, this is the day when it all comes true. My kids will be the same. My kids will be along that same line. Not because of what I do, but because of what God is doing. Paul, of course, picks up on this in his writings to the Romans. Paul uses me, Abraham, as an illustration of how God works in specific people's lives in specific times. And in doing so, he builds a case that God, not humanity, is responsible for fixing what has gone wrong in all of creation. You see, since the beginning of time, we've had this broken relationship. The relationship between God and humanity is off the mark. It's off key. It's broken. So the question is, how does it get fixed? And God chose me, Abraham, to show how it will get fixed. See, in my old age, God is able to show that God is the one who is responsible for salvation and making things right. In my family, God gave us the gift of reconciliation and righteousness, and God makes it clear that it is a gift. The problem is, in my demonstration, is that people usually get it wrong. People see me in the wrong way. Most people love my story of how I got up and I moved my whole family into the wilderness and we went to a new land and we were faithful and we did all the things that God wanted us to do. And while it's nice to recognize that, that is not the main point of my story. The main point of the story that Paul wants to lift up, and the same story that I like to lift up, is not that God made me righteous, not because of what I did, but simply because God wanted to give me a gift. And it's important to remember that it is not what I did. That is off the mark. It is not something that I earned. I made my way into Scriptures, not because of what I did, but because of the fact that God chose me. I am a theological giant because of what God did, and I'm only here because of God's Word. Now, when Paul was writing to the people in Rome, they were the Pharisees, and they were the brightest and the most brilliant teachers. They had some great arguments. And they stated that Abraham, that I was the model of the law, because I did what God required. I had earned it. I was declared righteous because of what I had done. They said, Abraham. Now, Abraham, he has something to boast about. Abraham is the one who we look after because he was so good. But Paul correctly argues in God's faith that it is God's faith, not mine, that made people righteous. If you pay attention to Paul's argument in his letter, he refers to several places throughout Genesis and points out that it was my trust in God, not in my works, that saved me, that saved an entire people, that saved the world. Paul's opposition will say Abraham is rewarded for his works. And this is a key point for all of our Reformed faith. Paul says no, it's not his works. Instead, it's his trust, it's his faith. It's God's faith in us. Genesis is not talking about a reward for work completed. Instead, Genesis describes that our being made right is a complete gift from God. How does this change the way that you look at the world? If you have been saved, not by what you have done, but simply because God has chosen you and has chosen to give you a gift, how does that change the way you view the world? How does it change the way you work in the church? How does it change the way you are with your family members? Jesus is one who presses this argument as well. He tells the story of a generous landowner who goes out and hires a group of workers to work throughout the day. The story is difficult for us Americans to hear because it's not one of fairness, but of generosity. If you remember the story, he hires laborers at 8 in the morning, and then again at noon, and then again at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and then he even hires somebody for 1 hour. And he pays that person who was hired in the afternoon at 4 o'clock the same as he did the people from the very beginning of the day. Now the person who was hired at 4 o'clock is ecstatic, but the people who worked all day long are not very happy. They say it's not fair. And God says, and the landowner says, no, it's not fair, but it is gracious. It is generous. Now, the idea that we have any control over the relationship with God is exactly what leads to idolatry. When we are looking out for that fairness, when we want to put ourselves at the center instead of God, that's when we get into trouble, and it's been that way since the beginning of time. We begin to praise our own ideas and find ourselves focused more on what we're doing rather than what God is doing. When we think we can achieve the correct relationship by keeping the law or our works or by what we do, rather than the fact that it's a gift from God, is when we struggle. Paul likes to talk about me because he knew that God was generous with me, working through me, and not rewarding me for what I have accomplished, but simply because I trusted. Simply because I put my face down and I said, do with me what you will, God. The good news is that when we remove ourselves from the center, we can and we do find room for God to work. God can do something that we never imagined. I mean, look at my life once again. When I took issues into my own life, things fell apart. Sarah was barren. Sarah wanted a child in the worst way. I wanted a child. And so we created a way for us for a child to come into the world. We had an outside person come into our marriage. And we ended up with Ishmael. When we let go and we let God and we allowed God to work in our lives, God came to us and said, you will bear a child. And we did, and we named him Isaac. Paul was keenly aware that we need to have a foundation in which to build our faith. And for Paul and for Abraham, that foundation is God. It is developing a faith that is built on a trust that defies the realities of sin. It is a faith that is not built on our behavior or our ability, but on a free gift of faith, God's faithfulness. Folks, your world is changing quicker than I ever could imagine. Took years and years and years for word to get out that I had this encounter with God. And now I can just simply tweet about my encounters with God and everybody knows right away. Think about it. Just 3 weeks ago, I was with the Presbyterian Church in Detroit at their General Assembly. I sat through the debates on divestment, and I sat through their debates on the marriage issues and the redefining what marriage is. And as I emailed and texted and Facebooked with Whit, we had a long conversation about what this will mean for the Presbyterian Church of Broomfield, and Whit wrote back and said, well, it's really not that big of a deal because in the state of Colorado there's a constitutional amendment against same-gender marriages. That was 3 weeks ago. In the last week, 3 new counties are now issuing marriage licenses for same-gender marriages. 3 weeks, the world has been turned upside down. And it's not just marriage. It's like Afghanistan and Iraq and financial issues, the banking issues, children at the border. And still, to be honest with you, I have a hard time believing that there is still so much conflict in my home territory of Israel. Talk about relying on ourselves and seeing what our own conflict management gives us. You see it in Israel. We're not very good at it. So I have some suggestions for you. Maybe we need to come up with a new way forward. Now, the sermon title that I picked for today is Dead Reckoning. And what I mean by dead reckoning is the process of calculating one's current position by using previously determined positions. Or advancing to a position based on a known place using estimated speed of time and course. So as we reckon a course, let us remember that it is God who reckons us whole and who brings us peace. We simply need to trust in God and to allow the Spirit to move in us in new ways. In this rapidly changing world, and as you calculate your position, may I suggest that you use me, Abraham, as your starting point. Your journey starts not with what you can do, but with what God can do. Doesn't that change where we end up? Maybe instead of dead reckoning, we could all use live reckoning, which instead of calculating your position with where you start, maybe we should figure out where God is and start there. Just a thought for all of you. Now, before I wrap up and move on, I do have a couple more things that I want to say to you in the modern church. One thing that I've been wanting to say for a long time, and I tweet this out and put it on my Facebook page every once in a while, but I want to tell the modern church to get over yourselves. I want to say, just get over it. You see, I've been to a lot of church meetings lately, and there's a lot of discussion on Twitter and Facebook and in meetings together and at Presbyterian events and even in other denominations about declining memberships. You all are a depressed bunch of folks. And it's really getting everybody down. So I want to say get over it, because you know what? It's not about you, it's about God. And in Abraham, we see that God will and continue to work even when you think everything is done with. I mean, Sarah really didn't believe that she was going to get pregnant in her 90s. She did. So don't worry about bringing in that super pastor. Don't worry about having that young pastor with the golden retriever and a bunch of kids. Or don't worry about social media or millennialism or music or contemporary music or what you're going to do in worship. Instead, focus on God. Focus on how God might be at work in the congregation. Focus on God, how God might be working in your life. A gift that we receive from God is faithfulness, and the fact that we are reconciled to God and to one another. I tell you to get over it because the church will not die. The church will not come to an end. Culture might shift and change might come really rapidly. We might have more people at soccer games than in church on Sunday mornings. But remember Abraham. Remember me. And use me as an example of that promise. As you move forward, I want you to pray. I challenge you to pray. And to especially pray for your pastor nominating committee. To pray that you can move away from the idea that you can bring anything into life that's not already going to come about because of God. What God is going to do is up to God. Instead, I challenge you to be an open vessel and to allow God to use you to bring God's good news to the world. To reckon a course that starts with God. Encourage you to pray that you might be that messenger of hope in all of your relationships. God can and will do some amazing things in your life. Even when a majority of the people are at soccer matches on Sunday morning. We are simply called to trust. We're not necessarily called to fix. We are called to trust and to allow God to work in the world. And before I go, I'm about done here, but I wanted to share a little bit of news from the pastor nominating committee. They've asked me not to share it, but this is too good of news not to tell you right now. I did interview with the pastor nominating committee. I did submit my personal information form. They were very impressed with my background. They could tell I knew my Bible pretty well. They were extremely impressed. And they were about to offer me the position, I think. They never came out and said it, but it looked like they were going to offer me that position. But they did have a couple concerns. When they realized that I was a grandfather and how many grandchildren I had, they realized that grandparents love to be with their grandkids. And they were a little bit concerned that I would spend more time out and about with grandkids than I would preparing sermons. So they have not extended that call at this point. But I would encourage you to pray for them as they go through that process. But please know, as your pastor or not, I do pray for you as my children, as my grandchildren. I pray for you often. I cheer your successes. I grieve your difficulties with you. Because I know it's not about you, but it's about the one true parent of us all. The one who can and will bring about new life and new hope, even to the old and even to the dead. The one God, the one Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, now and forevermore.